Hi, I welcome you all to our development seminar on smallpox eradication, inclusive histories as meaningful roadmaps for global health. And this is, as Sanjay tells me, this is going to be an interactive history lesson. Not lesson, okay. Uh, discussion on key strategies and player who actually spearheaded the smallpox eradication campaign. And this is especially important in current times when we are noticing vaccine preventable diseases outbreaks all over the world. And we especially want to focus on vaccination in India. So, and we have a great deal to learn from history, and hence this discussion is most relevant. So we have as our speaker Dr. Sanjoy Bhattacharya. He's the director and professor at History Department Center for Global Health Histories at University of York. He's also a Wellcome Trust senior investigator and the head of WHO Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories. He specializes in health, medical, environmental, political, and social history of 19th and 20th century South Asia, as well as history and contemporary workings of international and global health programs around the world. He has a BA from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, MA from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a PhD from School of Oriental and African Studies. And we have, as our discussants, Dr. Devendra Khandayat and Dr. Anjali Nair. So Dr. Khandayat is a Deputy Director and Country Lead of State Health Systems at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, India office. He is a medical doctor and a trained public health specialist with 20 years of experience in management and leadership experience with large health and development programs in India, and particularly in the field of immunization, infectious diseases, and disease surveillance. Prior to joining the foundation, he worked for WHO's National Polio Surveillance Project, where he has led polio eradication efforts in various states of India. Anjali Nair is Executive Vice President for Global Health Strategies in India, and she has more than 20 years of experience in global health issues. Her expertise lies in developing integrated advocacy and communication strategies aimed at impacting health policy and practice. So without further delay, Dr. Sanjoy Bhattacharya is going to talk to you for like around 40-45 minutes. And then we'll have our discussants who will join us for around 10 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Yeah.
So as Prachi said, this is going to be very interactive. So Nafil Council, Bioethics, small world. So it's going to be very interactive. So please stop me at any point for any clarifications. So I'd like to thank Constantino and Prachi for setting this up. Thank you so much for your care, and thank you everyone in Brookings for your invitation, which is greatly appreciated. So let me start with a picture of a smallpox victim. This child died, and she had been infected with variola major, which was one of the more infective forms of the disease, which could cause up to 50 to 60% death rate. The hemorrhagic version, which was luckily rarer, would cause 100% death rate. Even if someone who was stricken by a bad case of variola major survived, there would often be blindness. So even the survivors struggled after the disease. It was a disease that was feared. And let me start by saying that I'm not an anti-vaccinationist. I actually believe that vaccination is immensely important. And I do agree with what it says there at the top, that prevention is better than a cure. What I do take exception to is this simplistic historical timeline that is often presented. This historical timeline, which, for instance, was used in the World Health Assembly in 1980, at which smallpox eradication was celebrated by an international community, claims that in 1796, Edward Jenner discovered the smallpox vaccine, and that smallpox vaccine then allowed a situation to arise where in 1967, the World Health Organization pushed for smallpox eradication and pushes those efforts. And in 1990, the World Health Organization then declares smallpox eradicated. So this timeline suggests that the vaccine, the technology, is central, important. Now, I'm not downplaying the importance of the vaccine. What I am questioning is the claim of singularity, that there was a vaccine or the vaccine. The vaccine in 1796 was a vaccine that very quickly, as it spread around the world, took many shapes. Even in British India, people struggled to find natural cowpox. So natural cowpox was created by giving different animals, not just cows, pox. Human smallpox was taken out of patients in hospitals and isolation wards, and then used in new vaccine production units where goats, donkeys, camels were often given the pox. That pox was then harvested. That was then used to create vaccine. So what is important here is that at all points, whether we look at the first part of the timeline, the middle part of the timeline, or indeed 1980, there were always different vaccines. So therefore, the question I pose to all of you, having given you the preamble, did a vaccine make eradication inevitable? Now, this is the freeze-dried, now I'm making the same mistake that I said others shouldn't. This is one of the freeze-dried vaccines that was used in the smallpox eradication program. The freeze-dried vaccine was very different from the vaccine that Jenner produced. What Jenner produced was a form of what was called the wet vaccine. It wasn't heat stable, and that was one of the problems. Wet vaccine often didn't work, and you had to vaccinate using extremely painful methods, often targeted at children, and the vaccination wouldn't work, which then would create widespread social hostility to future programs. In fact, in 1930s, we found some wonderful files in Maharashtra State Archive and the UP State Archives, which showed that the vaccinators union comes up, and the vaccinators union's first demand is they need some arm protection, because parents would basically chase them out of villages if the first round of vaccination hadn't quite worked, and the children's wounds had just sort of healed, and the vaccinator would come in and say, can we have one more try at this? And they'd be chased out and sometimes beaten up. So the vaccinators union's demand was, we need armed bodyguards to go into some of these villages before we can vaccinate again. The freeze-dried vaccine was more reliable, so it meant that there was a greater chance of the vaccine taking, or the vaccine being successful. They were heat stable, which meant that the cold chain that was often lacking in the villages of South Asia were not as much an issue. They still needed to be stored carefully. But as we dug into the history of the vaccine, what struck me was that they were successfully tested both in the USSR and what was then East Pakistan by a combination of Soviet and US officials. So this doesn't quite fit the Cold War narrative, where sometimes historians talk about different types of vaccines, the Soviet vaccine versus the US vaccine. They were what Henderson later calls the smallpox eradication being a sort of bridge across Cold War rivalries. The other thing that comes out very, very clearly and quickly when you look at these archives, which are actually not used very much, is that there are technology transfers. And here, countries like India, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, Canada, China, Brazil are not supplicants asking with folded hands for technology, but actually playing off superpowers against each other to get vaccine production capacity. So Pakistan is I think, an amusing example where Pakistan is approached by the Soviet Union in the 1950s saying, America is offering you smallpox vaccine, we'll give you a factory. So the Pakistan foreign minister very quickly contacts DC and says, look, we're going to get a factory, so what's your offer? So then America says, we'll give you 2 factories, one for Dhaka and one for Lahore. So Pakistan gets 2 factories. India does the same. India gets offer of help from the Scandinavians, from the Danes, and it uses that against the Soviets and says, okay, what are you going to give us? And ultimately they get both. So we must not always presume that the so-called third world, as they were often labeled at that time, history is best studied in its own terms. That's what I keep saying to my colleagues, were actually actively seeking this technology so that they could be self-reliant and could actually get rid of the disease. This idea that smallpox eradication was an externally imposed program is also a faulty one, because it presumes that there is no sort of understanding that a damaging disease needs to be limited. But sometimes, apart from the vaccine, other technology mattered. And nothing is more powerful here about simplicity of technology than the bifurcated needle. A sewing needle with a hammered head that meant that you no longer had to make slits in people's arms, but just lightly, 8 or 9 pricks, after which, and that little bit of vaccine would enter the wound that had been created and immunize people. This also meant efficiency in the use of vaccine, meaning you needed less supply of vaccine. But what I want to highlight today, most of all, I love technology and history of technology. I really do it. I'm a nerd in that sense. I'd really go into manufacturing processes and try and understand how testing is happening. And that's another powerful history, but not for today. But what I'd like to argue that the hands administering vaccination were incredibly important too. And this is where the institutional histories, I think, lose out. They forget the fact that most of the work that happened, that made smallpox eradicated, was done with hundreds of thousands of pairs of hands that often came from country-level contributions. Country-level contributions that often economists don't calculate in monetary terms when institutional histories are created to show off the power of international contributions in nations. And this is something I think more interdisciplinary work has to be done to recover, I suppose, a new budgetary history of the smallpox eradication program. It is striking how much money is moving from state budgets and Indian central budgets in the Indian program, for instance, but doesn't get a look in really in the celebratory documents after eradication. So this is one narrative. As I was telling Prachi in the short chat we had, I'm not saying that any voice is unimportant, but for me, history is like a jigsaw puzzle. If that is a jigsaw puzzle with 100 pieces, what I'd like to argue to you here is the US CDC and their narrative of eradication, their voices are just one piece. And sadly, existing academic histories as well as institutional histories are predominated by this one set of voices. So I'm not downplaying the importance of the institutions, as I've told my friends in that institution. All I'm saying is more voices and more interest groups and more people, more funders, more social investors need to be studied as well. So the US CDC narrative talks about their campaign in Western and Central Africa, 1966 to 1970, when Francophone Africa is decolonizing, and the US federal government has an interest in developing greater political clout in that region. So the joint measles smallpox program falls into that larger program, and it's funded extremely well, and a large group of young CDC workers is sent to 20 countries in Africa to do work which many had thought was impossible. So they're important, no doubt about that. But at the same time, the CDC also has people in East Pakistan and Bangladesh, what is now the ICDDRB, doing all sorts of experiments. What I was not aware of till I hit the archives was that Johns Hopkins and Harvard actually have whole districts in which they can do their experiments as well. This is not something that was happening in India, but it was happening in Bangladesh. And then, of course, the CDC negotiated India, and I use the word negotiated in an extremely considered way, because they really had to negotiate India. In fact, the first shock was from the airport. They could only sit in Delhi. They couldn't go into the States till they had permissions, necessary permissions from the External Affairs Ministry. And this, if you look at the biographies, this is something that still rankles. How dare the Indian government not let us go wherever we wanted to go. But hey, that was... But it represents, these three cases, how different political contexts changed the way the CDC was able to work. Even if the post-eradication CDC narrative is one of uniformity and linearity, it's not. What is very striking to me is India determined how international teams were put together. The Indian government would often put a Soviet worker with a US worker, and those teams would also have usually 2 Indian workers. When I interviewed Karan Singh, he said, yeah, that was our strategy. If the US guy tried to do something, the Soviet would report him. If the Soviet guy tried to do something, the US guy would report him. So it was very effective, and the Indians would report on both. So, it was a very controlled sort of situation.
But did that mean that the process was so standardized that it could actually be just scaled up in different permutation and combinations of workers?
In India? No, because there were negotiations at state level as well. So, so often, for instance, in Bengal, West Bengal, this is the example that comes straight. They wanted Claudio Amaral, who was a Brazilian, who was very, very popular, and he and his wife, and they were just seen as accepted. Football Mad Bengal wanted a Brazilian worker. So there were different levels of negotiations, but international workers had, the composition of the teams had to be cleared by the central government and okayed by the state government as well. So India was not standardized, but yes, as a rule of thumb, international groups couldn't form as they wanted, as they could in East Pakistan, and go wherever they wanted. So it was a much more constrained negotiated process. And the Soviets were in the same boat. It's not as if the Soviets had any extra leeway. So so the power of the Indian polity was very striking. And again, downplayed, I argue later, in the histories that come out. So they then go to the east, the Horn of Africa, which is the last reservoir of smallpox, and they play a role there as well. But what I would like to argue today is that institutional histories are histories of the few. All these American actors you see are important. I'm not saying they're not unimportant. Bill Feig is there. I'm sure you've met Bill Feig. But but if we just focus on their biographies, or indeed only their communiques from the field to write our histories, we have a necessarily limited history. That's a fair. Ah, it's okay. It's working. It's working. So, what do? How do we democratize this history? I use that term. So, I think there's a need to shift focus. As I said before, for every 100 CDC workers, there were many thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of national and local workers implementing eradication programs. We need to recover more of these voices. We need to remember that the WHO was not monolithic. It had a headquarter. It had a well-funded smallpox eradication unit, but what is very clear is it's not calling the shots. It has branches in each regional office of the WHO, especially in Delhi, which has another powerful office, but they're often not in agreement. We need to study those disagreements to understand the challenges as well. There were, at all points of time in WHO, in relation to smallpox eradication, a multiplicity of views about whether eradication was important or possible. There was no agreement. So WHO headquarters and US CDC could speak to the central government, but many provincial, state, and local governance structures that were involved in day-to-day negotiations, at least in the beginning of the program, could not be reached by them. So as the program started, or intensified in 67, I would say from 67 to 72, it was a learning process for the WHO where they realized that they had to negotiate, had to create links, had to create trust with state government structures and representatives. So it's very much a learning process. It is not a set of ideas being brought in from outside and just being implemented. It is something completely different, a set of ideas that is hitting a new context, is seen as not fit for purpose, being redesigned, and then being implemented. So it's a completely different process from what we see in official WHO histories. And there were many social determinants that CDC workers or other WHO workers, including Claudio Amaral, he often spoke about that when we interviewed him, that were often alien to them, caste. They had to understand, they had to navigate ideas, interpretations of caste. Of course, there is no one understanding of caste. Class, gender, religious and political affiliation was always a factor in negotiations to get people to accept smallpox vaccination. So what I'm trying to say here is that there were many conversations and many actions without the involvement of the WHO and CDC in Africa or indeed in South Asia.
Sanjay, just a clarification.
Yeah.
How did this entire process start? From the beginning of the campaign,
Yeah.
there might have been several beginnings from where it
Yes.
was 1980 when you declared
Yeah.
eradication.
That's an excellent question. So when I started off with my first Welcome Fellowship in 1997, already forgot, I was much more accepting of the timeline that it all started in 67, because that's when the intensified program started. But as very quickly as I hit the archives, it became apparent that actually in 1958-59, with the Soviet Union proposes smallpox eradication at the World Health Assembly, and it is supported by majority vote. The reason it gets the majority vote is because several countries, usually Warsaw Pact countries, but also China, which were allied to the Soviet Union, which had had access to Soviet freeze-dried vaccine, had made dramatic advances in eliminating smallpox. So there is a very, very rich history between 58 and 67 that remains understudied, under-researched, not enough is written about. I have a PhD student now working on the Chinese case study, and it shows that China is importing the vaccine. It's seen as a very powerful means of showing that the new Chinese government means to do good, and it eliminates smallpox, and because the disease is feared as well. But all this feeds into the belief in 1958 that it is possible. The Soviet Vice Minister is very honest when he stands up in the World Health Assembly and makes a case for smallpox eradication. What he says is that they have a fantastic primary healthcare system through which immunization is provided. They have a fantastic vaccine, that the Soviet Union has eliminated smallpox 2 or 3 times, but then cases keep coming back from Afghanistan and Iran. So what he says is actually very honest. It's actually an admission of failure, saying that we cannot get rid of smallpox unless we work globally, internationally. So we are now trying very hard to recover the story between 58 and 67 as well, and argue that that is as important as the period 67 to 77. And there are, as you put it, there are many beginnings. We should not assume there was one beginning. Western Central Africa was not the beginning. So, have I gone? So, the other thing to remember here, oops. One more. If we go back one, please. Yeah. So here, I want to highlight one more approach that we took that was, in terms of research and analysis, extremely useful for us. So we soon realized that the public and the private views of many of the main actors of smallpox eradication often diverged. And yet, a lot of the histories that had been written on the basis of public pronouncements, lectures, and published reports. But if we start in the middle, we have Habdan Mahler, the WHO Director General at the time of the so-called intensified phase of smallpox eradication. He had distinct public and private views, and we only found this out accidentally because we were focusing on what was happening in the regional office. So Veer Gunaratne, the then Sri Lankan regional director of Sierra, doubted that eradication of smallpox was possible and wondered whether it was not a massive waste of time and money. And it's only when we started looking at his correspondence with Mahler we realized Mahler was of the same view. And yet Mahler was standing up at many important meetings and saying, yes, let's eradicate smallpox. So privately there would be opposition, but publicly there would often be support. So as historians we have to be aware of this. We cannot just lazily take one public view and make huge generalizations. But as I started studying those papers, for me, my biggest heroine in this entire story is Nicole Grasset, who has largely been airbrushed out of history. I mean, Prachi and I were discussing this. I mean, during my interview with Karan Singh told me that he would not shut a door in Nicole Grasset's face because Nicole Grasset would kick a hole in the wall and come in. So they learned very quickly that she was, an amazing negotiator. She wouldn't take no for an answer. She almost got thrown out of India because she broke all diplomatic protocol and wrote a 7-page handwritten letter to Indira Gandhi, woman to woman, saying why she hated living in Delhi, but she was going to stay because she had a job in hand. And Indira Gandhi's secretary, Dhawan, wanted her thrown out, but ultimately she wasn't thrown out because Henderson said he would resign if Nicole Grasset was thrown out, and then the Indian government at that point backed off. But what you see is that Grasset starts talking to state-level administrators, starts creating trust with bureaucrats, politicians at the state level, but also very importantly, negotiates alternative funding, which is often not even recognized in existing history. At one level, she gets the Tata Foundation on board. The Tatas actually donate doctors, public health workers, and a huge amount of money at a time when the program is running short of finances. We must remember that the final phase of smallpox eradication program was at a time when the oil crisis was at its height. She goes to Tehran and negotiates a special consignment of petroleum to be given to smallpox eradication workers with the Shah, signs off. So she is able to go and get a range of alternative funding without which we could argue that the smallpox eradication program across the world would have ground to a halt. You have Indira Gandhi, Sanjay Nixon there, who had private and public views. It's once J.R.D. Tata gets on board. What we found in the WHO archive was a handwritten letter from J.R.D. Tata to Indira Gandhi, basically saying, "Dear Indira, you need to support the smallpox eradication program." And she basically listens to J.R.D. Tata. Next day, there's an announcement on All India Radio asking the nation to support the smallpox eradication program. There are hints there that J.R.D. Tata has an important role to play in supporting the party, and this letter is freely available for anyone who wants to read it in the WHO archives. But it is an incredible letter of how interventions that Grasset made possible changed the course of some very senior governmental attitudes, which had been lukewarm towards smallpox eradication, to being fully supportive of smallpox eradication. Then you have Henderson, who was another amazing CDC worker. In fact, my own sense is Henderson was often seen as too much of an internationalist, too accepting of the importance of local contributions. So when smallpox eradication finishes, he doesn't go back to the CDC, he actually goes back to the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where he becomes a dean, because he is too much of an internationalist. He doesn't just plug the CDC narrative, historical narrative. The historical narrative becomes a very important signifier of loyalty post-eradication to the institution. We can discuss that later if you want. So there are, I would argue, many more million histories in South Asia, mainly because it was the world's largest reservoir of smallpox. It of course had a long history of vaccination from colonial times till after independence, and the independent Indian governments were not daft enough to say that colonial rule was a good thing, but they would say that they had experience, but they knew how to fill the gaps left by the colonial rulers, and therefore, kept pointing out to the WHO negotiators that they knew a thing or two about immunizing against the disease, surveillance networks, the importance of keeping good data. Indeed, from 1962 onwards, there are a series of pilot programs in India, and this goes back to the question you asked. The results of the pilot programs, which are held in Mysore and held in Maharashtra, near Belgaum, was central to India agreeing to be part of the intensified program. Up till now, the historical narrative is that a set of experiments were successfully carried out in West and Central Africa. The Indian government then accepted the success of that work and then signed up to the program. India only signed up because there was this amazing epidemiologist, Rao, who was in constant touch with Donald Henderson, who was carrying out these pilot programs. And the success of those pilot programs led to India signing up to an intensified program. And indeed, it could be argued, and I have this in a confidential email, which I can show any of you, that Donald A. Henderson wrote to me, that India, in a way, had experimented with the containment surveillance method of smallpox control between 62 and 65 before the Western Central African program started. So again, we can discuss this at a later time. So if we are looking for lessons in history, there are many lessons in many languages. And what has also been extremely important in our work, in my work, has been to study material, archival, unpublished material in many languages. And I call it the need to recognize and beware of the lost in translation danger. What do I mean by that? So many of the field reports from northern India, my Hindi, I'm a Delhiite, so my Hindi is better than my Bengali, so I always focus on the Hindi memos, most of all from, let's say, Eastern UP and Bihar, were Hindi. But often the WHO coordinator for a state would need to get those translated into English before they could be sent to regional office and headquarters. So what I started doing, I started working backwards. I would read the original, then I would read the translation. I would usually, almost 90% of the time, find that the translation was shorter than the original. So silences were being created because of many political and social negotiations. And then I would study the English Sierra version and then read the final version that went to Geneva, and that would be even shorter. So I would study silences back to, and then try and find out who was creating the silences, what political pressures were creating the silences. And often the silences are the data, represent the data that can give us lessons, because they talk about local adaptations, local interpretations, local problems. But of course, there are people in Delhi and Geneva who don't want those local innovations often to be discussed, because they want it to be seen as a top-down program, whereas it is at all times a bottom-up program. So, so my students love it. So one of the things I do with the master's thing, I show them translations, and I want them to interpret these silences, and I learn so much from. There are so many ways of interpreting these silences. I mean, there are so many languages. I showed my Bengali-speaking students some reports written in Bengali, and again, it was not just a Bihar and Uttar Pradesh phenomena. I showed similar reports from Assam to students, and again, it is a nationwide phenomenon.
So, I'm a bit curious, is there a top-down narrative being built, or could be the cost structures? Meaning, the more you contextualize, the more you customize, it's costlier, probably there'll be delays, and maybe that's the right way to do things in a democracy. But the cost, do we have an estimate of how much customizing would have led to cost escalations?
So, do you want me to answer as a historian using my sources, or do you want my own view? Because the historical sources, this argument is there all the time. There is this pushback against innovation, saying that we have limited budget, we have limited time, so we can't innovate too much, we can't spend too much time in social negotiations. There were people who wanted fairs to be organized before an immunization program, so huts, so people would come in, special huts, and news would be spread, and then people would be engaged, and next day different villages would be targeted, so that force was not used. In those unpublished papers, there is also the view, let's just use the military. So Paul Greeno has written, military police, has written very powerfully about this, about Bangladesh and India. And Paul writes, as an American academic full of guilt, he presumes, even in his guilt, that international power is the most important determinant here. And he's writing guiltily about the fact that villages are being encircled at middle of the night, doors being kicked in, people being thrown to the ground and being forcibly vaccinated. But as I keep telling Paul, that if you really read those reports in the vernacular, that is, you replay the silences, you find out that the ideas often coming from local, these plans are being made with local security apparatus as well. And the people who are encircling the villages are usually Indian security forces. So as people are trying to run out, people who are grabbing hold of people who are trying to run away and throwing them in for the international worker to sit on them and forcibly vaccinate them are often Indian security personnel. So these are debates, do we do it this way because it's cheaper, quicker, or do we engage, which is, but the argument always from the people who support engagement, historical actors who are saying, let's engage, let's spend more time, is they're saying that ultimately if we use force, in one place it will happen there, but rumors spread, information spreads. And then we'll have intractable problems in another part of the state. So the time we save here will mean more time being spent somewhere else, with people will be running away. And often cases of word spreading, news spreading by word of mouth, and people running off into forests as vaccinating teams were coming in. So there was this debate all the time. And I think we see that in current eradication programs as well, right? It's over budget, over time. So maybe greater engagement, greater investment of time in local vernacular engagement might have saved time in the long run. And that is something you see. And this is what fascinates me. This is why I say there are multiple histories. There is no one view of doing it. And usually in the southern Indian states, where actually they eliminate, and Goa, where they eliminate smallpox first, and then all these workers go to northeast India and work in Bihar, Bengal, and northeast India, and feel as foreign sometimes as the international workers because they can't speak the local language. Keep saying this, that we are struggling to socially engage, but perhaps we should invest more, try and get local stakeholders, so they then get local stakeholders who then help them engage. So force was used, but not as widely as Paul Brainor suggests in that article. And ground level workers want to avoid force, because we have to remember that they too had bodyguards, but usually 2 bodyguards for a team of 6. And there's a marvelous section in another article by Paul Brainor where he talks about how suddenly they woke up and their hut was surrounded by lathi wielding hundreds of people who then proceeded to beat them up. So, so we must remember that the international workers and national workers from other parts of India are human, they have fears, they have concerns, and that makes them want to negotiate more than perhaps people sitting in Geneva and New York. So I would very quickly, 40 minutes, would very quickly like to suggest that commemorative histories are best seen as contemporary politics. They tell you more about the needs of today than what happened in the past. So the big red book of Smallpox Eradication, which came out in 1988, the year polio eradication started, is more a description, I would say, of the politics of 1988 than what really happened between 57 and 1980. I have seen the multiple drafts of these chapters. The first draft of the chapter on India was about 30 pages longer than the final draft of the chapter that came out in this book. Because India just put the red pen on things it didn't want said. So we have to realize the negotiated nature of these WHO histories. I realize I'm live, but none of my WHO colleagues will, I think, disagree with me on this as they see this recording. Equally, look at that photo. Beautiful picture, isn't it? Henderson on one side, Margaret Chan in the middle, Havdan Mala, everyone smiling sweetly at us. But these 2 men hardly spoke to each other in the 1970s because they were on opposing sides. So we have to remember that, photos. That is the smallpox commemoration statue outside WHO headquarters. Again, not an easy statue to create. What was going to be the race of the vaccinator? What was going to be the race of the person being vaccinated? Everything was negotiated. So that statue, when you look at it again next time you go to the headquarters, look at it. It's the most de-racialized statue possible, so that no one can say that we're trying to show a white man vaccinating a black man. So this is all politics. Smallpox, death of a disease by Henderson, chapterization differs. He's an author in the Big Red Book. The West Africa program comes in the middle chapters, meaning it didn't start out there. That's one of the reasons I could see the CDC workers really angry at Henderson. What, a CDC person writing this history and we're not chapter 1? In the biography, when he tries, I think he tries to make peace with CDC, it is chapter 1. So again, there are things. The Smallpox Eradication Program archives being set up by his daughter Lee Anderson, wonderful collection. But the act of collecting and the act of presenting silences so many voices. I was telling Prachi, if you look at the Emory University CDC online archives, there's one Indian actor, Mahendra Datta, very important. But a person who was not as problematic as some of the other argumentative Indians who worked with the CDC. So that act of creating an archive would suggest who's the important actor, Mahendra Datta. And if the historian or the policymaker who wants to use history for future policy doesn't have much time, it's very easy then to fall trapped into saying, okay, you just listen to Datta and that must be the only interpretation. It isn't. So we have to recover many histories. There are gaps in our understanding about what happened in the USSR. I have a PhD student working on China. There's a massive gap. I mean, for a long time, a country of 1 billion people that had eliminated smallpox and which had helped justify the smallpox eradication in 1958-59, that entire history was ignored in the official histories prepared post-eradication. It's just staggering how silences, how Anglo-centric some of this work is. Brazil had its own innovation. Sri Lanka, Ceylon had its own innovations. Afghanistan had its own innovations. Iran was one of those contexts where the Soviets and the Americans worked straddling Cold War tensions. Somalia and Ethiopia, these are all big gaps that need to be studied, and I have studied smallpox long enough, and I'm hoping future generations with the languages that are necessary will come in. We mustn't forget the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, Saudi Arabia, the Hajj. Immense public health undertakings. If we are now to look for lessons about how to control MERS, surely the history about how smallpox vaccination and surveillance was carried out in the MENA region, or indeed the Horn of Africa in relation to the Hajj, gives us as many lessons as other programs carried out in Europe or Northern America can give us. There are complexities of the certification of the worldwide smallpox eradication program that haven't been studied properly. For instance, South Africa. South Africa was in unofficial control of countries like Namibia and Angola. Again, sometimes the politics, people don't want to discuss these difficult politics, but it gives us very important information about transnational border surveillance and vaccination policy in civil war contexts. This is something, we're constantly talking about reconstruction and stuff like that. I'm constantly thinking about these contexts when we're in our Nuffield Bioethics Council meetings. There are many forms of internationalism. So one of the things we have tried to constantly underline is that if Bangladesh and India are working together, that is international as well. International doesn't have to be when a few Northern European or North American countries suddenly turn up and take part. Internationalism literally means more than one country working. So, if we define internationalism as something as a program where the US funding agencies or European funding agencies are involved, and that is how we're going to define our research from the very beginning, we will never look at other forms of internationalism. And yet there are other forms of internationalism in South Asia, be it between Burma, Bangladesh, and India, or indeed even ceasefire programs at a time of war between India and Pakistan, where both countries realized that smallpox was a dangerous foe. These are important histories. More work is needed. So I argue that after all, global health needs to understand and cope with great diversities to succeed. And that's the end. And I think I've stuck with it.
Ms. Anjali Nair to join us on the podium.